Let me introduce our first keynote speaker, Amira Roess.
Thank you, Ben, for having me here. I'm really excited to share some of what we learned along the way. And what I will do is introduce the larger team and the greater context of our research. And then I'll move into the MERS study that's been funded by NSF and talk about how we've been studying the human-animal interface, the way we interact with each other, our movement. Then I'll talk a bit about what multiple disciplinary research is, some challenges, implications for training, and some ideas for ways forward, including how we might be able to overcome some of our challenges in working globally. So I've been really fortunate to work with lots of individuals from many different disciplines, both at George Mason University, where I am now, and a few other institutions around the world. I've been funded by quite a few organizations, and the MERS study has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Eeid program. We have a large team that includes wildlife biologists in the US and in Ethiopia, cultural anthropologists based in the US and also in Ethiopia, and some of the top coronavirus virologists in the world who are based in Germany. One of our colleagues is a modeler at the University of Georgia, and poverty geographers and environmental experts at George Washington. So the broader context of our research is really focused on the emergence and transmission of emerging zoonotic diseases. And I've starred the pathogens that we're working on now. What we typically do is we examine the broader social behavioral context, and we make sure that we collect data or we do field observations to understand risk and protective factors or behaviors, care-seeking behaviors, and barriers to both care-seeking and to implementing some of the protective factors. We also take into account some of the standard demographic and economic factors, healthcare access and food security, and social support and resilience, which also impact transmission of infectious diseases and also the human reaction to infectious diseases, how sick we might get. And our team is often thinking about the so what implications of our work. You know, what are the policy implications of our work? What have we learned that could maybe help with surveillance infrastructure or multi-sectoral or multiple disciplinary interventions? We also, in our global work, think a lot about the international health regulations. Like everybody else these days, right? We're using a lot of technology to help us in our data collection, but we also have team members who look at the impacts of technology on human behavior. So our team came together in 2012. We were working in a few different countries. I was working primarily in Egypt at that time. And in 2012, this new coronavirus popped up, MERS coronavirus. And a lot of us were paying attention because we remembered what happened in 2002 when another coronavirus, SARS, popped up and caused a lot of disruption and a lot of fear. And so when MERS popped up, you know, I was working in Egypt with a couple of the colleagues who you saw their names on the screen. We were working on One Health training and other zoonotic diseases, and we became really interested in MERS. You know, and we were talking a lot about like, what is going on? You know, what is this? It's been long recognized that this threat of emerging zoonotic diseases is not new, but it seems to be intensifying. And we asked the questions that you all ask yourselves, you know, is it related to this explosive growth in the human population? Is it related to this rapid globalization, rapid movement across the globe, and maybe an increase in urbanization? Some of the other drivers that we think about, climate change or changing habitats in response to these human population pressures and globalization, how we react in terms of food security, new types of food, and what our economic impacts or reactions are to all of these different drivers. And so, we stepped back and we also thought about what are we doing now as a science, right? We have lots of different kinds of modeling tools that we use to try to inform interventions and policies. And as we all know, they are not perfect. And, there are lots of jokes out there that models do really poorly at trying to predict things. And what we were thinking was, maybe it's that we need to think through how to incorporate social, cultural, and behavioral factors into these models instead of just sort of doing what we've been typically doing up until the point that we were meeting, which is produce the standard models and then step back and sort of think about, well, how social and cultural factors may have impacted the models. So instead, our group was thinking, well, let's just try to incorporate these factors right into the models. So we came up with a proposal to bring together our big, diverse team. And what we said was, let's do a strong research question that really incorporates the social sciences to more thoroughly describe the multiple species, what we're calling the multiple species commodity network analysis in the Ethiopian context, in the MERS coronavirus context that we're working in, and we'll incorporate that or integrate it with some of the standard epi and health sciences approaches to understand MERS coronavirus and other coronavirus emergence and transmission between humans, wildlife, and livestock, specifically camels. And then we're also looking at the broader environmental context and taking things like weather and vegetation and human, animal, and wildlife movement into account. And we shared our disciplinary methods, and then we modified them over and over again to try to come up with this interdisciplinary tool to try to collect all of the different types of data that we wanted to collect. And the integrative step here would be to bring together all of these different types of data into a predictive model. And so we're in the process of collecting that data now. We're about halfway through. And so some of what I'll be talking about, we've already done, and some of it we're still working on. This is just an example, a snapshot of the type of activities we're doing in the field. So camels are born at what we're calling a point of origin. And then they move to a few different places. Broadly speaking, we are calling these points of trade. And then eventually they move on to the point of export, or the point of processing, or the point of consumption. So at each of these three basic points, we're sampling camels and humans and wildlife in order to detect coronaviruses. And we're also doing what we call focal follows to actually observe the behavior of these three broad species. And we're watching how they interact with each other, how they move around each other, and how they move through this commodity network. We're also doing a few different kinds of surveys that I'll talk about in a bit. We're also going into some protected areas to sample wildlife and to collect wildlife fecal samples. And the reason we're doing this is because we're seeing that camels are moving not just through these points, but they're also being moved through protected areas in order to find new sources of food and water in response to some of the changes we're seeing in the climate. So this is a very rough map of some of the major camel movement routes in our study area. There are many more throughout the country. And what we've done is, first, we mapped out the sort of known and stable or historical mapping routes, where camels, where large numbers of camels traditionally are born and raised and then moved for trade. Then from the points of trade, they go on to many different places, including points of export. Throughout the study period, we've also been updating these movement routes. And what we've seen is that there's been a lot more changes and a lot more new camel movement routes have been popping up. And a lot of this is due to the severe droughts that Ethiopia has been experiencing over the last couple of decades. And we're also seeing extreme flooding at times, increase in temperature. And this has also meant that animals are going into a lot of what was once called protected areas. And here are just a couple that we're working in. We've been updating our maps by doing a lot of key informant interviews and doing participatory mapping exercises where we talk with people who live in the area and we ask them about, where they've seen camels being moved. So by collecting information from multiple sources, we're able to get a better idea of where exactly the current and the historic camel movement routes are. And what we're hoping to do eventually is write up our methodology and just sort of explain how we integrated methods from some of what the anthropologists do, the social scientists do, and other individuals on our team do to come up with an integrated method. So in addition to the mapping, we've also been doing lots of surveys and observational data collection to understand more about the human-animal interface and movement. So I mentioned focal follows in one of the earlier slides, and this is something that wildlife biologists typically do. They often will have cameras up in strategic locations so that they could observe animals over a 24 to 48 hour or whatever period they decide. And the way it works is that you observe the area, and every 15 minutes or every 30 minutes, depending on the wildlife biologist, they'll stop and then they'll put together an inventory to better understand the animal's behavior. And so we're doing this with the wildlife and the camels and the humans. We also are borrowing from what we typically do as epidemiologists. So I'm an epidemiologist when we are trying to collect information about network, who's interacting with whom. And this has been done in detail when we're doing studies of sexually transmitted infections. Poverty geographers also do something like network data collection. And here, we're basically doing a lot of the same things. We interview people, learn about who they interact with, when they interact, under what context they interact, and then we go to their contacts and we ask them similar questions in order to have a broader understanding of the network and how these different species and groups interact with each other. Then there's the in-depth and the semi-structured interviews to understand the how and the why of these interactions. And we're doing those with both women and men, especially those who are involved in camel husbandry and camel trade and camel movement. And then there are the closed-ended surveys that help us quantify some of what we've been observing in the qualitative steps and in the observational data. And, a lot of our colleagues who are based in the West, they've been asking us, why don't you just use collars or mobile phones or other ways of tagging and tracking individuals? So my answer is usually, now these are great technological tools, but for what we're doing, and in many parts of the world, they're not actually a solution that you can 100% rely on. And a lot of you who are out in the field completely understand this, right? There's lots of issues with technology, especially in areas that don't have adequate or reliable electricity sources. In parts of Ethiopia, we routinely are dealing with brownouts, and these are planned and timed in order to deal with drought and disruptions to electricity. And then there's also things like political strife when the powers that be turn off electricity, turn off mobile phones, and that's really disruptive when we're trying to rely on technology. One recent example of how technology gives us great tools, but they're often not solutions, has been what we've observed here in the US. A lot of us, have tried to download apps on our phones to help with contact tracing related to COVID. And overall in the US, this technological solution to COVID contact tracing actually failed, and it's being written up about and it's been discussed. And the reason it failed was because we didn't use it as a society to the level that we really needed to in order to see this effectively supplementing contact tracing. So, I often work with the team members on trying to understand exactly, how do we use the technology to help us out, but also recognizing that this is a tool and it's not a solution. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, what multiple disciplinary research is and what the implications for training are. Intradisciplinary work, right? It's when you're working within a single discipline. And this is often where we focus our graduate training, right? We're training our students to be really good geographers or really good virologists. And sometimes they even go into subspecialties, coronavirus virologists, right? Multidisciplinary work is when people from different disciplines, they come together and they work together, but they're not necessarily integrating their methods or their theories. And that's where interdisciplinary work comes in. Here, we're really trying to learn from each other's disciplines, integrate our approaches and our methods to come up with innovative ways to tackle more complex problems. And a lot of the work that my team does is in this interdisciplinary space. And then there's transdisciplinary, which is oftentimes more practice focused and really trying to take the interdisciplinary work to the next level. Now, I often talk with my colleagues about this, and we all agree that interdisciplinary work, even multidisciplinary work, is not for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. The worst thing that you can do is try to force yourself to do interdisciplinary work if you don't really believe in it or aren't really enthusiastic about it, and that's fine, right? All of these different types of research are important, and we all build on each other. Over the last 20 years, we've been doing lots and lots of interdisciplinary work, and there are some things that we've learned. You have to sort of teach your graduate students, and you have to make sure that you train your colleagues on. And a lot of these are what we might call soft skills, right? How to talk with each other, right? So our graduate students, they start off with that intradisciplinary training, that in-depth training. And at a minimum, what I hope we do and what our group is doing is exposing them to multiple disciplinary research and giving them opportunities to spend a semester doing multidisciplinary work. So one thing we're seeing is that they really do need exposure to those soft skills, learning how to work on teams, and not just for our students, but also for us. When I was in grad school and I started to work on the human-animal interface, it was like a big joke, right? The veterinarians would say, we're the real doctors, we work with multiple species, and the human physicians would say, no, we're the real doctors, we work with the human species, right? And then everyone would kind of, in part joking, but not really, talk about this. And so, right, we sort of have to move past some of that and, just sort of be humble in what it is that we're doing and recognize that there's so much out there and that we really do need to learn from each other's disciplines. And if you're doing multidisciplinary work and interdisciplinary work, you sort of have to take this belief that no one discipline takes priority. As soon as team members start talking about how their discipline is the most important one, things fall apart. And we saw that as we were building our team for the MERS study, right? We had colleagues who joined the team, and then after a year, they just sort of had to drop out because it just wasn't for them. They couldn't, move out of their mindset that, engineering is the most important discipline, epidemiology is the most important discipline, right? That just doesn't work. It breaks down the trust, and you need that trust so that you can have very open conversations about, how your discipline does things and maybe where it stops short. And you need to be able to ask each other what you might perceive as a dumb question, right? But you need to be able to ask it in sort of a safe space, right? Because that's the way that we learn from each other. Some individuals are just personality-wise, right? They're just able to listen to each other, and they're more open, and they're open to learning from each other. And it seems like there may be opportunities to train in this, but there is also a personality aspect to some of this. And this has been written up in detail in other spaces. You can do a whole 1 week workshop just on this topic. I wanted to share that it's not just the disciplines that have to learn to talk to each other, but also when you're doing global work, as a lot of you have to learn to talk to people from other cultures and backgrounds. And often, what we find is that the animal scientists in Ethiopia do things differently than the animal scientists in the US or in Egypt. And, they start to talk with each other, and they learn from each other, and they sort of see where the commonalities are. So, right, we're also dealing with the differences at the cultural level. There are some things that we all have to acknowledge as we're putting together our interdisciplinary teams, right? First, it is hard to get support, both financial support and other support, funding support for interdisciplinary research. It's challenging to also have your interdisciplinary work peer reviewed, whether by funders or by journals, right? Because peer reviewers do tend to still exist in their silos. There are growing opportunities for interdisciplinary work, but one of the remaining challenges is in the peer review space. And this is an opportunity where we could step in and train our students to think more broadly and respectfully when they're looking at what's being done in other disciplines. It's sometimes challenging to put together interdisciplinary teams, and sometimes you need a longer period of support to build the team and then to keep the team together. And I mentioned that training, is something that our team is working on. You're seeing in many universities and colleges, there's a lot of lip service to interdisciplinary training or multidisciplinary training. And a lot of us do worry a bit about, where the funding is. And sometimes I think the powers that be are also worried about the future of interdisciplinary work. There's small steps that, we are seeing, small steps that we can take, for example, to bring together different disciplines when you're doing things like serving on a dissertation research committee, right? Different disciplines will have different requirements. Journals of different disciplines also have different structures, and these could be opportunities to streamline a little bit. NSF and NIH have been trying for a while to accept each other's bio sketches, and that takes training, but these are important steps that a lot of us could get engaged in. I have just 2 more slides here. Another thing that I want to mention is doing global work is really important. And I think we're seeing, and a lot of us, of course, we believe that global work is important. We learn from each other, and we need to keep asking, how are we doing? Where do we need to do better, especially during this period of time for the last, 10 years, there's been this growing rhetoric that's anti-science, anti-globalization, not just in the US, but in many other places. Part of what we need to do is to continue to foster our global collaborations in the face of these harsh realities. Another thing that in the US that we're working on is trying to make sure that we're honestly addressing the legacy of colonialism, structural racism in education. And again, this is where I think we can do much better. I gave a talk at one of the international rabies conferences, and this came up not just in rabies cases, but then around us in the conference. Where were the indigenous scientists? Where were the Black scientists, right? And so that's something that we need to keep asking ourselves. We need everyone's perspective as we're doing interdisciplinary work. And here's something, if you're interested in, the National Academy of Sciences put together this report. It was a long time coming, and it just came out in 2021. It should have come out 40 years ago. But anyway, we need more conversations about this. The NIH just last year, at the end of 2021, they revamped some of their grant reviewer training. And one thing that they did is they spotlighted a researcher who shared how, he's constantly facing, the reviewer's bias, right? And he shared a story about how he was at Hopkins, he wrote these grants, they got funded. The reviewer said things like, he's doing great work, he's in a great place. But then as soon as he moved to a historically Black college, the reviewers were suddenly very negative, even though it was just a continuation of his current work. Another thing I'll mention in our global work, right? I mentioned that the colonialism, right? The legacy of colonialism, that past is actually really present in a lot of our global work. And one thing that I saw time and time again in our global work, and that our team members have seen, is that there are some bad actors that all of us know about, and we hesitate to talk about this because none of us want to create problems, especially in this anti-science reality right now. But we do have to acknowledge this and address this because, when there are individuals representing science or a country and they're constantly misbehaving in the countries that they're invited to work in, that does hurt the science as a whole. So with that, I will stop and I will turn it over to our moderator. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amira, for an outstanding and really visionary talk. We have time for a couple of questions. So people are coming up for the mic.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk. And so you started out with this idea that one of the reasons that our models might not be performing super well is because we aren't incorporating this behavioral data and mobility data. And I was just wondering if you've have any results like validating that hypothesis and showing how the models improve once you bring in these other data streams.
Thank you. We are in the process of building those models. And so I don't have a direct answer for you right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question on the Zoom chat from Madeline Peters. She says, thank you for the interesting talk. I'm curious about how you and your teammates incorporate cultural knowledge, sensitivity, and realities into forming policy recommendations. For example, it's easy to say wet markets should be banned, but the reality is they are a cultural feature and necessary for many people who live without access to store and home refrigeration.
Yeah, and this has come up time and time again. And that's absolutely correct, right? These are important sources of food. They're culturally very important, and it is extremely dismissive for, foreigners or outsiders to come in and say, these are bad, we should ban them, right? That is absolutely the wrong way to go about addressing some of these issues. Instead, what we try to do in our work is we learn about, the wet markets or the livestock markets in the places that we work in. And, we observe, we do the in-depth interviews, and we work with our colleagues on the intervention side to figure out, at what points could we come up with culturally appropriate food safety interventions. And for us, what we found in our experience is that That's what's important right now. Having a realistic, culturally appropriate, and acceptable food safety intervention at that point is much better than just saying, let's ban everything, right? And what happens when you try to ban something that's culturally appropriate? It goes underground. And so, right, that's just the reality. And having our team of cultural anthropologists, social scientists from multiple countries is really critical because they keep on, putting us in check.
Terrific. Thank you again, Amira.